But then what do you do in the 20th century? The 20th century in philosophy is really a swamp. It's from the perspective of the overall history of philosophy, what's happened since the year 1900 is enough to turn even me into a dance major or a theater major. It really is depressing. Philosophers have pursued dead end after dead end. They have developed systems that they presented to the world as the last and final word about the truth, and then within a matter of years everybody realized that this last and final word about the history of philosophy was a self-contradictory dead end. Logical positivism, phenomenology, existentialism, names like Heidegger and Jean-Paul Sartre. Let me just tell you about Sartre, all right? But I just want you to realize what a really depressing picture philosophy presents in the 20th century. Jean-Paul Sartre was one of the famous existentialists of the 20th century. Morally, he was a pretty disgusting person. And the disgust certainly carries over to what the man presented in his existential philosophy. He was a man, well, you can see that for yourself by reading any of his novels or any of his short stories or any of his plays, or certainly his biggest philosophical work, Being and Nothingness. Sartre became the idol of post-World War II hippies, people who were attracted to irrational existentialism. But all the time that people were idolizing Sartre and following his existential philosophy, he had abandoned it. This is what's so funny about 20th century philosophy. These people develop a system or develop something, make it famous, and then they abandon it themselves and go on to something else. So while Sartre was still being idolized by hippies and other existentialist types, he'd become a Marxist of sorts. I have to say that his Marxism was about as despicable as his existentialism was. Sounds like I'm in a bad mood today, doesn't it? And then Sartre's Marxism caught on, and, well, then he died. But let me tell you the rumor about Sartre's death. Again, you must realize that here is a man who made his life's income by repudiating the existence of God. And the story that I have from a very reliable source is that on his deathbed, Sartre converted to Catholicism. Now, there's really nothing funny about, you don't know whether to laugh or what, but here is a man who, when finally confronted by the specter of death, repudiated everything that he had stood for during his lifetime and said, there must be a God. But you don't hear about Sartre's deathbed conversion in college classes on the history of philosophy. You don't hear about that. In fact, I've been trying to track down the one place that I did read it. It's not exactly a scholarly source. All right, I'll tell you where I did read it. I read it several years ago in the pages of National Review magazine. But the source was a specialist in French philosophy, a man who knew Sartre, and I believe that story. There's something to it. Well, this is the picture of 20th century philosophy, logical positivism. This was a system that said it was finally going to rid the world of religious metaphysics and of theological metaphysics. It would turn propositions like God exists into meaningless nonsense. And then within 10 years, we all realized that logical positivism was itself nothing but nonsense. Gordon Clark's book ends, we might as well read it now because I don't know where we'll be when this particular class ends. But Gordon Clark's book ends on page 433 with a surprising statement, a pessimistic statement. Let me read from 533. He says, "The history of philosophy began with naturalism, and so far as this volume is concerned, it ends with naturalism. It began with sophism, and it ends with sophism." In a sense, most of the 20th century philosophers who are treated as heroes were nothing more than reincarnations of the old sophism that Plato and Socrates had battled in their daytime, in their lifetime. And what Clark leaves you with is the idea that philosophy seems to run in a circle, that human beings never learn from the errors of the past. And perhaps the reason why the history of philosophy keeps ending up in circles is because human beings keep trying to find the truth while all the time they're ignoring God's revelation of the truth. This is really Clark's point. No matter how smart you are, if you ignore the truth that the all-knowing God has revealed to us, the history of philosophy is a story of defeat and frustration. The history of philosophy doesn't really get you anywhere. It just shows you how foolish human beings continue to make the same errors and continue to revive the same old nonsense. Remember those 7 errors that I told you Plato combated in his day? Hedonism, relativism, and all of the rest, mechanism. That's where 20th century philosophy ended up. So Gordon Clark finally ends his book by saying, "Could it be that a choice must be made between skeptical futility and a word from God? To answer this question for himself, the student, since he cannot ride very fast into the future and discover what a new age will do, might begin by turning back to the first page and pondering the whole thing over again. This will at least stave off suicide for a few days more." Well, there's an important point there.